Testing. Good? Hello? Right. Can you all hear me? Does this sound like a good volume for folks? No? Really? Little louder? Good? Okay, cool. Well, then I guess we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Liz, and I would like to welcome you all to Bluestockings. For those of you who have never been here before, we are a radical feminist bookstore, activist center, and fair trade cafe. We have been around for 15 years, and we're volunteer-powered, collectively owned. Yeah, so I'm going to pass around a donation bucket. It's $5 suggested, but absolutely pay what you can. It really does help. We're trying to keep radical spaces in Manhattan possible challenge. So yeah, and then I'm going to let the presenters introduce themselves. Thank you so much for coming.
So we are using the mic, is that the suggestion?
We can start maybe trying it without, and if people can't hear, then, or up to you.
Or either way.
Maybe try both.
Okay, we'll see. We'll see what works. This is on. Hi. Very nice of you all to come here. First of all, I wanted to... Can you hear me? Is this mic actually... Yeah, there it is. Okay. First of all, I wanted to say thanks both to Bluestockings for hosting this event. This is a wonderful, lovely space, and also to everybody for coming out tonight, especially because the weather has turned chilly these days, and it's wonderful to see you all here. My name's Debbie Bookchin. I am Murray Bookchin's daughter, and a journalist and author, and I'm here with Blair Taylor, who is a scholar and PhD candidate at the New School, and who's currently living in Berlin, where he's studying or working sort of as a fellow, an Einstein fellow at the Free University of Berlin. And we are excited to be presenting this book, which is a collection of essays that my father wrote mostly in the last 15 years of his life, and he died in 2006. And it's called The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies and the Promise of Direct Democracy, and they're essays that specifically address the question of organization and what kinds of organization might bring about the kinds of social change that we are all so interested in creating. I'm going to turn the mic over to Blair for a few minutes so that he can start off with a little bit of background about Murray and sort of set the scene. And then I will speak a little bit about this particular, the essays in here and the particular reason why we think that this book is a very timely addition right now to the political debate on the left. So here, without further ado, is Blair.
Thanks, Debbie, and thanks to Bluestockings for putting this together, and all of you for coming out. I'm just going to try to give a little bit of an overview of the trajectory of Murray Bookchin's political ideas and talk about how they kind of changed over time, some of the key debates that informed some of his theoretical and political moves. And it's hard to condense Bookchin's thought because he wrote for over 60 years, over 25 books, spanning from philosophy to anthropology, political theory. I mean, he was really kind of a polymath, urbanism, ecology. But what I want to suggest is that in many ways, Bookchin was very much ahead of his time. While often his political developments and his ideas were ignored or marginalized at the time he was writing them, they became conventional wisdom on the left 20, 30, or even 40 years later. So that today, the basic grammar of the what I would call the neo-anarchist orientation that underlies a lot of the activist left, Murray was really one of the key architects of these political ideas and these theoretical moves. So to give an idea of some of his ideas and their impact on the left, I want to focus on three kind of what I would think are the key phases of his thought and his project. So the first, I think, was his critique of Marxism and his counter-articulation of this concept of hierarchy. So although Murray had been writing since the 1940s for a variety of communist magazines, he was a red diaper baby, Jewish communist based here in New York City. He was a very early critic of Stalinism, soon became disillusioned with old school communist politics, drifted into Trotskyism, drifted then into utopianism, and slowly towards anarchism. But it wasn't really until the New Left came that he found kind of an audience for his rather unique political constellation, and especially these new issues that were coming to the fore of race, class, gender, sexuality, alienation, things that didn't so easily fit into the old Marxian categories of class and exploitation. So central to Murray's rethinking of the revolutionary project was to kind of try to displace the idea of class and exploitation, not completely, but to expand upon it, to replace it with hierarchy and domination. He tried in a way to kind of out-Marx Marx, who's this grand thinker of universal history. He's like, actually, you're only talking about one aspect of history. You're only talking about economic exploitation and class. I'm talking about the whole schmear, everything. So he really wanted to expand this, to get away from this kind of economic reductionist analysis of the world. And this was quite novel at the time. And although the early New Left was speaking a language of participatory democracy, he was right there when it turned in the late 60s back to Maoism and Marxism. And pretty soon the main organization of the New Left, the Students for a Democratic Society in 1969, collapsed into a bunch of competing Marxist and especially Maoist sects. And at the time, although he was unheeded, Murray was there circulating a pamphlet called Listen Anarchist, which was very prescient in both its... Listen Marxist, which was very prescient in its critique and was also articulating a different kind of politics that was a prefigurative politics, we would call it today, but was a constellation of direct democracy, ecology, decentralization, a political lens that looks at hierarchy and domination in all its forms. I just want to actually play a short clip where Murray speaks about this political development and his ideas. It's actually from the documentary Anarchism in America, but this particular clip was put on BBC recently by this guy Adam Curtis, who's a documentarian who is exploring something that Debbie's going to talk about later, the connection between Bookchin's ideas and the PKK and the Kurdish revolution happening now. It's on...
And the conclusion I came to is this, that the workers' movement never really had a revolutionary potential. That the factories, and I had worked in factories for 10 years, and had worked in factories partly as a labor organizer in the old CIO, before it united with the AFL, when it was still in a very militant, stage of its development. But this workers' movement had never really had the revolutionary potentialities that Marx attributed to it. But in point of fact, the factory, which is supposed to organize the workers in Marx's language, mobilize them, and instill in them the class consciousness that is to stem out of a conflict between wage labor and capital, in fact, had created habits of mind in the worker that served to regiment the worker, that served, in fact, to assimilate the worker to the work ethic, to the industrial routine, to hierarchical forms of organization, and that no matter how compellingly Marx had argued that such a movement could have revolutionary consequences, in fact, such a movement could have nothing but a purely adaptive function, an adjunct to the capitalist system itself. And I began to try to explore what were movements and ideologies, if you like, that really were liberatory, that really freed people of this hierarchical sensibility and mentality, of this authoritarian outlook, of this complete assimilation by the work ethic. And I now began to turn very consciously toward anarchist views. Because anarchism posed a question not simply of a struggle between classes based upon economic exploitation. Anarchism really was posing a much broader historical question that even goes beyond our industrial civilization. Not just classes, but hierarchy. Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school. Hierarchy as it exists in sexual relationships. Hierarchy as it exists between ethnic groups. Not only class divisions based upon economic exploitation. And it was concerned not only with economic exploitation, it was concerned with domination. Domination which may not even have any economic meaning at all. The domination of women by men in which women are not economically exploited. The domination of ordinary people by bureaucrats, in which you may even have a welfare, so-called socialist type of state. Domination as it exists today in China, even when you're supposed to have a classless society. Domination even as it exists in Russia, where you are supposed to have a classless society. You see? So these are the things that I noted in anarchism, and increasingly I came to the conclusion that if we were to avoid, or that we are to avoid, the mistakes that were made over 100 years of proletarian socialism, if we are to really achieve a liberatory movement not simply in terms of economic questions, but in terms of every aspect of life. We would have to turn to anarchism because it alone posed the problem not merely of class domination, but hierarchical domination. And it alone posed the question not simply of economic exploitation, but exploitation in every sphere of life. And it was that growing awareness that we had to go beyond classes into hierarchy and beyond exploitation into domination that led me into anarchism and to a commitment to an anarchist.
So as he mentioned, this wasn't just an abstract conclusion he came to. This was in part informed by his activist experience as a labor organizer, where he saw the working class was not, becoming radicalized. It was actually becoming more docile, more inured to capitalist forms of life. So the result of this putting hierarchy back at the center of the left project was a fundamental rethinking of the anarchist theoretical project. Although anarchism has always been opposed to all forms of oppression, domination, hierarchy, Murray really puts this together and comes up with a conceptual apparatus that kind of makes sense of these in the abstract. So his book, Post-Scarcity Anarchism, which collects most of his writings from the New Left, it's published in 1971, really is kind of one of the most important re-articulations of contemporary anarchist theory. Although, as I mentioned, this was mostly ignored at the time. He had a speech he was intent on delivering at the 1969 last conference of the SDS. It was ignored. However, in the wake of the decline of the New Left, the new social movements of the 70s and 80s, these were often described as the little brothers and sisters of the New Left. People who had been disillusioned by the authoritarianism, the machismo, the turn to violence of the late New Left, started articulating a different kind of politics, which very much built directly on Murray's ideas. They're the people that more or less coined the term prefigurative politics, started using consensus, started using affinity group structures. These are groups like the Clamshell and Abalone alliances on the East and West Coasts that did, a combination of feminism, peace, anti-nuclear activism. These movements really start to shift. They explicitly reject Marxism. Even if they don't call themselves anarchists, they're kind of neo-anarchist in spirit. And it's these movements that then exert a very strong influence on the alterglobalization movement that emerges in the 1990s in the streets of Seattle, which then in turn influences Occupy Wall Street. A lot of the people, David Graeber, Brooke Lehman, who helped found Bluestockings, David Solnit were veterans of the alterglobalization movement and have been very much shaped by this whole political history. So the second aspect of Murray's thought that is really important and really changed how we see the left is his turn towards ecology. Murray's really probably responsible more than any other thinker for introducing the concept of ecology to the left. When he was first talking about, in 1964, he wrote an essay called Ecology and Revolutionary Thoughts, which really quickly became widely read in SDS and the New Left generally. Meanwhile, the mostly Marxian New Left made fun of him for this. They called him the Smokey the Bear anarchist. You have to see the reception of this idea to see how far out of the box he was thinking. His first book on ecology was published about 6 months before Rachel Carson's classic Silent Spring, which is kind of the book that started the environmental movement. And he wrote things about global warming way back in 1965. So what he was trying to attempt to do was looking in the period of the 1960s where you have working class abundance, by and large. You don't see workers getting radicalized. You don't have the old economic exploitation leading to immiseration and poverty, and therefore the classic Marxian scenario leading to revolution. So what's going to be the core of a new revolutionary crisis dynamic? Well, Murray arrives at ecology. Ecological degradation caused by capitalism's inherent grow or die logic. I want to read a little snippet from actually the book, where he explains how he sees this as central to the revolutionary project. The consequences of this grow or die market economy must inexorably lead to the destruction of the natural basis for complex life forms, including humanity. It's all too common these days, however, to single out either population growth or technology, or both, to blame for the ecological dislocations that beset us. But we cannot single out either of these as causes of the problems whose most deep-seated roots actually lie in the market economy. Attempts to focus on the alleged causes are scandalously deceptive and shift our focus away from the social issues we must resolve. So for him, the ecological crisis was inherently a social crisis, in contrast to groups like the Club of Rome or the Malthusians that kind of put it as, humanity is inherently a plague. It's about population, it's about technology. He said, no, it's about capitalism, and we can change capitalism. We can change our social relationships because it's human social relationships of hierarchy and capitalism which lead to the exploitation and degradation of nature. This turn to ecology also for him was very important because it has secondary kind of strategic importance. And that was that in contrast to Marxism, which pitted class interests, you know, the working class against the owning class, ecology was important because it posed the possibility of a trans-class revolutionary dynamic, a generalized interest in human survival that actually could include everyone, not just one class or the other. And he was keen on pointing out that the working class was never a majority in any society. In any case, so we want a majoritarian revolution, we have to expand the concepts which drive them. In the 80s, he became even a more important ecological thinker as ecology became, you know, more accepted within the left. He was a central figure of debate with Dave Foreman and Earth First. He had a lot of arguments with deep ecologists, whereas social ecology, you know, saw the ecological crisis as a social crisis. Deep ecologists often took a more misanthropic route or analysis. He had big debates with Dave Foreman, who was one of the founders of Earth First, yet was a Goldwater Republican. He did not come from a left-wing tradition. Therefore, Earth First in its early days took some very racist positions against immigration, against population growth, for HIV and AIDS as thinning out the human population. And Murray saw all these misanthropic tendencies as very dangerous, very reactionary, and pointing towards authoritarian solutions. So in the end, there's a book, it's actually the book that I first read when I discovered social ecology. It's called Debating the Earth. Maybe they have it here. And in the end, kind of Dave Foreman has to just kind of concede the floor that he loses the debate. And me, as, believe it or not, a dreadlocked Earth Firster in the Pacific Northwest, reads this guy destroying one of my, you know, political heroes. I'm like, oh, I gotta go check this guy out. So soon thereafter, I went out and studied at the Institute for Social Ecology and ended up here. Okay, the third phase, the third most important thing I think about Murray's political development is after spending 50 years within the anarchist milieu and doing so much to revolutionize it, to give it a new kind of updated political theory, in the 1990s, some tendencies within the anarchist movement or milieu start to really piss him off. He's engaged in very strong polemics with people like John Zerzan, who's an anarchist primitivist who thinks that we need to get rid of technology, even language, and this guy was a key influence on the Eugene anarchists, the Black Bloc of Seattle. Other arguments with Hakim Bey, of the proponent of temporary autonomous zones. He wrote a book called Social versus Lifestyle Anarchism, which was decrying this kind of individualist turn of the anarchism of the 1990s, which again came very much was very much influenced by the punk rock movements, very focused on veganism, on personal lifestyle, and he saw that anarchism was in danger of losing its broader revolutionary momentum of the need for not just personal transformation, but social transformation, for organization, for political change. So he was having these debates for a decade. Some of them got very heated. And in the end, after anarchists telling him, hey, you're not an anarchist, he said, okay, maybe I'm not an anarchist. He started developing his own politics, which he called variously Libertarian municipalism, and then later on, Libertarian municipalism. Debbie's going to talk all about it in a minute. And so what Murray wanted to do in the end was come up, and this is actually consistent throughout his entire political project, is reconcile the anarchist desire for freedom and a critique of the state as an instrument of domination with Marxism's attention to institutions and attention to questions of power and organization, but without the authoritarianism. So Murray was very keen to find what he called the forms of freedom. How can we, he believed, unlike many anarchists, that you cannot abolish power, but you can only arrange it in a more emancipatory, egalitarian way. So let's figure out how we can do that, what that kind of society would look like. And for him, this was the politics of direct democracy, popular assemblies, confederation, which Debbie Bookchin is now going to tell you about.
So, a lot of people are familiar or came to Murray's work because of the fact that he really did, as Blair said, introduce ecology very much as a concept into radical discourse. And, you know, it's something that he did, to his credit, many decades ago, and that really he saw as an overarching way of, and as Blair said, a trans-class way of enlisting everybody in the question of what kind of future we were going to create for ourselves. But even back in the 60s, he was very concerned about the question of how you organize and what are the forms of freedom and what are mechanisms by which we can actually bring into being the kind of social change that we're so desperate to make. And so he undertook, among other things, a study. He was always extremely interested in history and anthropology and sort of other areas of inquiry, and he undertook a study, a historical look at some of the forms of organization that he found fecund in terms of their potential, their possibilities for helping us find a way into the future. And eventually, sort of after going through the trajectory that Blair described, he arrived at the idea of communalism, what he calls communalism, after he abandoned anarchism, which he had tried to work within for quite a long time, for really about 4 decades, I would say, he spent as an anarchist. He felt that the only way to really institutionalize the kinds of change that we wanted to see in society was to work on the municipal level. And so he called the overarching theory communalism, and he called its political practice libertarian municipalism. And the idea was that within local communities, on the very most grassroots level, we would work to create structures, basically popular assemblies, that would start to not only empower people, but also function as a kind of a growing countervailing power to the nation state. And that these assemblies, of course, and we've seen examples of them, and for example in Occupy, during Occupy Wall Street, that they would be decentralized, that they should be transparent, that they should be inclusive, that they should enlist the opinions of everybody, and that they should also be very much opposed to representative democracy. In other words, he was extremely concerned about, for example, what he saw happening within the German Green movement in the mid-'80s, where you started out with a party that was supposed to represent the grassroots, that was supposed to be ecological, that had certain principles, but that once it started electing people to higher national office, became increasingly, I don't want to use the word corrupt, but corrupted by that kind of nation-state representative politics. So, you know, I think actually that this idea that he really sought to flesh out over the last, especially over the last 15 years of his life, and again in these essays, is particularly important today. And one of the reasons why we were excited to put these essays together in book format, many of these essays had appeared either in very small journals. There's also some original material in this book. But one of the reasons we were excited to do this is because of the sort of upsurge, the new social movement direction that we've seen that is really not only here and with Occupy Wall Street, but we see all over the world, in squares all over the world, where people are calling for direct democracy, where people are seeking ways in which we can institutionalize the kind of empowerment of individuals on the local level. And, you know, one of the things that's been happening lately, and I was, for example, just at the, and maybe other people here were as well, at the Left Forum here in New York last spring, and we heard some very eloquent speakers, you know, Cornel West and Stanley Ronowitz, and people talking about the need to really take our activism to a new level, and the fact that we have to find, especially even people like Naomi Klein now, who are popularizing the idea that capitalism is on a collision course with nature, something which incidentally Murray said as Blair pointed out, 40 years ago. But and it's great and it's important, but over and over again we see calls for greater protest. We're mobilized for the climate change march. We're told to do more civil disobedience. But I think that the question that we have to ask ourselves is, is it enough to simply challenge the authority of the state, and do these protest efforts at a certain point dead end? And how do we go about going from challenging the authority of the state to actually usurping the authority of the centralized nation state? And that's really what he was concerned with. And so he finds an answer to this question by looking at the municipality. And Murray was also a real big student of cities and urbanization, and that question sort of following in the steps of Lewis Mumford. Cities obviously are complicated, and these gigantic urban megalopolises on the one hand serve to really often to make us feel extremely disempowered and to make individuals feel powerless. But he also saw the potential, looking again historically, for example, at the polis, the Athenian polis of ancient Greece, and looking at other models, even recent models like the way Vermont town meetings can function on the local level in order to, in which people meet together face to face the first Tuesday of every March and make decisions about their communities. And so he found inspiration in those models and felt that on the most local and sort of municipal level, if you can be transparent, if you can be accountable, if you can have a situation where people really can come together and make decisions, that you can actually start to enhance community power and confederate. And that was another very important issue for him. People raise the question, well, it's one thing to work on a community level, but how do you deal with great global problems? And the idea that he promoted, and again, this is one of the articles in the book in which he talks about the need to confederate, is that you go from the municipal assembly to delegates who meet together as a body from a number of assemblies, and that you slowly kind of build a larger network that allows people to make decisions that affect entire regions. So, so this was something. So this was something that he elaborates in these essays, and it's something that I think that we are excited to present as a way of perhaps looking at a kind of a third pole between the more traditional anarchist modes of organization, where people put a lot of energy into establishing alternative, whether they're food co-ops or squatting or rent control, sort of an alternative society within the shell of the larger society, versus the more traditional socialist mechanism of seizing the power of the state, which Murray felt was really, you'd only look at the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 that he felt was really a dead end, and instead looking at some of these American traditions and some of the impulses that we see all over, and including right now, very excitingly, going on among the Kurds in the Mideast, in Rojava and in parts of Turkey, where people are really starting to try and implement this idea, this concept of libertarian municipalism, and finding that it's not only a mechanism of empowering local communities, but that it's also, in a sense, helping people sort of reclaim their subjectivity. And I don't know how many people are familiar with what's going on in Rojava, and I'm sure most of you have heard about some aspects of it about, certainly about Kobani and the fight there against the Islamic State. But one of the things that happened during the last years of Murray's life is that he was contacted by Abdullah Öcalan, and really, while he didn't get into a extensive dialogue with him at that time, was in fact sending him literature, and Öcalan was reading his work on libertarian municipalism, as well as the broader context in which it exists, books like The Ecology of Freedom. And he really changed his whole Marxist-Leninist outlook and decided that instead of focusing on the Kurds, creating their own nation, that what they really wanted to do was focus on autonomy and build a society in which all people, women, and also ethnic minorities would be able to function on the local level and really govern their communities. And so we're seeing a lot of this really in an amazing kind of experiment, especially considering that this is a war-torn region. We're seeing a lot of this right now come to fruition, and it's been exciting not only because of the sort of the contesting of the power of Turkey, Syria, of the centralized governments, but also because you see when you, as Blair mentioned, when you see what is going on in these communities, people are just very excited. There's a kind of an electricity there that really, I think, is representative of what it means to take control over your own communities. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention before opening it up, because it's great to have some discussion, is that I just got back just a couple of days ago, actually, from being in Italy, and which is a place that I've spent a lot of time and lived. And of course, the Italian government is completely dysfunctional, the centralized government in Italy. But one of the things that's happening there is that also as a result of climate change and huge climate issues that are resulting in flooding, and there was the earthquake in L'Aquila, and all kinds of problems, you see increasingly on the local level people getting together and sort of stepping into the breach where the government has failed or the government just doesn't have the interest. And there's this cry for community control, and it's actually very exciting. And so what Murray is suggesting in these essays, and what we're talking about and hoping that people will start to really debate, is how to institutionalize these forms of power. Whether, Murray, for example, urges that people consider running candidates on the local level. And that has always been a kind of a contentious issue certainly within the anarchist community. But he says on the local level, if the candidates run, if their election to, say, a city council helps strengthen the general assemblies and the community councils, that they can actually be very effective in helping to build a countervailing force to the nation state. And that this is ultimately really the only way that we're going to be able to sort of seize the power that we need to create a new society. So with that, I'll just open it up for any questions or comments. And I don't know if people want to use a microphone or just get up and talk. It's good. Please, yeah.
How would Murray feel? Oh, I'm blowing it. Sorry. I just forgot what you said.
Oh, no
And
problem.
I'll remember it again.
We'll come back.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any thoughts, comments?
I guess I've been trying to figure out for a while. Can't totally figure out why it's mutually exclusive, like libertarian municipalism and anarchism before like 1960 or before the influence of continental philosophy. Or it seems that it's just kind of like an extension of
Well, Blair might also have something to add, but I don't think that it's a question so much of exclusion. I think that what Murray felt as he segued away from anarchism, and that's leaving aside the question of lifestyle anarchism, and but even within social anarchism, is that we have to contend with the issue of power, and that I think he felt that anarchists often felt that somehow power was just going to dissipate, that it would go away, that we would, and he uses an example of Spain in 1936, the failure to really, once the workers had seized control against the Francoist forces of Catalan and Barcelona, the unwillingness to sort of take that power that they really had in their hands at that moment led ultimately, as we all know, to the defeat of the revolution. And so what he argues is that we have to acknowledge that power will always exist, and that the question is who has it and who uses it and who controls it. And so that was one thing. And then there are also specific things. He's arguing, for example, within confederalism that communities will work together, make decisions, and that they will, once those decisions are made, that the communities will be bound by those decisions. It's not that they can't change, and it's not that, if you have a majority vote in favor of something, that a minority can't continue to advocate for its point of view. But, he doesn't believe in the sort of Proudhonian idea that, well, if you don't like it, you simply just withdraw. So he has a certain respect for law and structure, agreed upon, of course, created by the community. But does that answer a little bit your question?
But I think it's also like potential questions.
You have more questions?
I guess the first answer sounds like just something like a deeper, like a more ecological socialism, and then the second part sounds more like republicanism.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. He took a turn towards like the civic republican tradition later in life, and as Debbie said, he did get interested in questions of constitutionalism, of law, of how do we give these ideas structure, which I think he didn't see in the anarchist milieu, and certainly not in the classical anarchist milieu either, which, not only did they not talk about, they had this kind of sensitivity towards non-economic forms of repression, but for example, Emma Goldman, when she talked about free love, she was criticized by Lucy Parsons, who was ironically a anarchist woman of color, for being divisive and middle class, because these distracted from the primary contradiction of the class struggle. So I think that's like one real difference. And the other being, anarchism is a very open and heterogeneous tradition, so you have everything from, primitivism to Hakim Bey, to everything in between. I think he felt that anything that's just so open, we have to be more specific, and it doesn't offer a very specific strategic orientation. And the one that did most clearly was anarcho-syndicalism, which he very much disagreed with. He didn't think that you should run society from the factory floor. He thought that gave too much power to the dismal science of economics. He wanted to abolish the economy as a separate sphere of society and subject all of human society to rational democratic control.
Which is another aspect of his libertarian municipalist approach. As Blair said, that the economy itself is really controlled by the community, not by the workers, not by the people in the factories, but by the community, and that allows people to really, that it dissipates the power. It doesn't allow for, it democratizes everything, that you democratize the economy, and that you can separate people who have an administrative function. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have an engineer, that if we're going to build some kind of public, hopefully wonderful mass transportation, light rail that would work within ecological parameters, it doesn't mean that you don't have experts and expertise, but they are simply following the will of the people in the community who vote in a certain.
I'll take one
Sorry.
thing at a time. I have about 3 or 4 because it's so stimulating. But who controls the society? Does he feel? If you say there are people who control, I don't know which country you're talking about. Say we're only talking about the United States. Who does he think controls the power of the United States?
Are you talking about right now or within?
Always.
I mean,
it's always who controls the power. When we had 2 separate countries, when the South, that was a power structure for my money. In the North, it was a different power structure. The 2 power structures came in to argue who was going to be in control. But it doesn't sound like, the way you're saying it, that he believes that, the way the words that you were using before, it surprised me, that there isn't a power structure. We use the word economy, and we're all part of it. We're not.
no, well, I mean, Murray very much believes that there's a power structure. I mean, that's the point.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you usurp the power of the nation state and bring it back to the community, bring it back to the local level, bring it back to the people who deserve to make decisions about their own lives. So he certainly understood that power relations were predominant, that they were, absolutely sort of a fundamental aspect of modern life. But the question is, how do you, there's one idea is that you somehow seize state power, and then you have a dictatorship of whatever, proletariat, Bolshevik elite. I mean, and he believed that as long as you have that kind of representational politics, you will never have the power on the local level, and you will never give people the opportunity to really chart their own destiny.
There are 2 things. One is, if you say, like little countries or a state was very democratic and did away with the control of the industry in Detroit and the people generally shared, who would come in and destroy that? The power structure of the country, because they wouldn't allow it. Just like we change governments all over the world, because we don't like them or we need certain other things. So I love a quote, and I use that very often, of Shakespeare. The fault, dear Horatio, is not in our stars and what we believe in, it's in ourselves. So to me, how would he, does he have an approach to getting people? See, to me, the only reason you have change is there's a necessity among all people. I happen to agree with you. When I was a kid, I wasn't sure that the other thing would work because the capitalist structure in the United States, they gave away health insurance, unemployment insurance, all these things to stop change. But I felt also, it's very interesting to me, that change would have to be all over the world, like climate change. And how? But what is the power structures? That's not true. It's a lie. So I wondered how he would approach that.
Well, one thing, this is a dual power strategy, kind of a classic left concept of building something in tension with existing forms of power. And he actually believed that it was quite likely at some point you were going to have to defend those things with popular militias. For example, of course he hoped that it wouldn't come to that. There would be a majoritarian movement that would preempt the need for such things, but he was not opposed to such things. And he wasn't opposed to some level of coercion in terms of, when we're talking about confederated communities. If one community is dumping toxic waste into a river that's going downstream, he had no problem with, democratically these other communities forcing them to stop that, because those things happen in the world.
It's a production thing where the power structure in this country, all the corporations that can make money doing that, will do it.
Okay.
So not just taking one.
Let's take some more questions.
I'm sorry.
You've had a lot.
I just love what you were talking about, and I apologize.
Not at all, not at all. Lots of hands. Maybe this fellow with the glasses.
Hi, thanks. Thanks a lot for everything you said. It was very enlightening. I had a question, I guess, just about internationalism in Murray Bookchin's thought. I guess there were just 2 things earlier that made me think about it. One was about, I guess, like his pessimism about the role of the working class in revolution. And I guess just I don't know, trying to think about it. I guess I don't know a lot of things I would want to know to answer a question like this, but trying to think about it like in global perspective, I guess like the U.S. working class, although large, is like perhaps like not too expensive to buy off for domestic tranquility as opposed to like the imperialism that's practiced elsewhere. And then I guess I was also wondering about it, like kind of connecting it to the question of the Kurds that you guys were discussing. I guess just like kind of the prospects of having that kind of society in a world that's otherwise like, you know, like this, and then also maybe like the promise of climate change as a global issue and being, you know,
Yeah, no, good question. I think it relates to the last one too. I think the idea of confederation was key to this. I mean, Murray wanted to see these, you know, locally, directly democratic communities, popular assemblies, confederated into increasingly larger concentric circles to deal with these global problems. I mean, obviously, he understood that looking at the Bolshevik Revolution and other, you know, socialist revolutions, you can't actually have socialism in one country. When Francois Mitterrand came to power in France in 1980, what did French capital do? They left. There's a lot of economic and political questions that are pose questions of scale that I think confederation is one answer towards addressing. And in terms of like internationalism and nationalism, there's actually an essay in here called Nationalism and the National Question, which looks at kind of the left's historic orientation towards the nation state and towards nationalism, and especially the new left, which often embraced national liberation struggles as one revolutionary moment. He was very critical of this. He saw this led to very particularistic, violent, separatist, and non-universal political orientations. He wanted an Enlightenment universalism that wanted to emancipate the whole of humanity. And this could only happen, you know, on a very, very large scale. I mean, he really lamented the loss of some of these old left values of internationalism, of, you know, the international brigades going to fight in the Spanish Revolution. And I think it's actually a great honor to his work and his memory that now it's being taken up by the PKK in Rojava and Kurdistan. And there's people, you know, unfortunately there's more people going to fight on the other side, but there are people going to support, raise money for, you know, people that are putting libertarian municipalism into practice under very adverse conditions.
I have a commentary. Sure.
Can we actually, 1 second, let's, how about, we can break it up and...
Sure. So I guess kind of building on that, I'd be really curious to see how his ecological thought and political thought could sort of come together, because it seems like there's radically different skills at play in both problems and a problematic timeline. It seems like, particularly in survivalist communities and preparers, some of these sort of practical tactics are being brought up for a sort of inward-looking survival rather than a global solution. I mean, is this perhaps more a strategy for surviving rather than overcoming global problems?
You know, I think this is a sort of a roundabout answer, but one of the things that Murray was really deeply concerned about was preserving Enlightenment values. And, you know, one of the reasons that he was so interested in the local level kind of organizing and in cities and their potential, and some of these things are also very eloquently discussed by people like David Harvey in Rebel Cities, is because he really saw the polis, in the Greek, to use the Greek word, or the municipality, as a realm for human freedom. And he really believed that, in a sense, this kind of exercise of democracy was the true calling, just in the way the ancient Greeks described it. It was sort of our telos, and I use that word carefully because, you know, the telos often implies some kind of fixed end, and there is no fixed end. You know, there's no guarantee that the acorn's going to grow into the oak tree. But on the other hand, there's this idea, there's this potentiality, and there's this striving, in a sense, and for the fullest realization of what a human life can be. And for him, that was about freedom and maximizing freedom. And I think, sort of, to go back to sort of the question of survivalism, that kind of life in which it's, you know, everybody for themselves and we're going to protect our little plot of land, it goes against those Enlightenment values. It goes against the notion of, you know, of mutual aid, of complementarity, and in a sense, his ecological approach really reflects that, what he called sort of unity in diversity. We embrace diversity as a way of strengthening, just like you do in an ecological web, as a way of strengthening life for everybody, or a community for everybody, and every community is stronger because it's more diverse. So obviously he would be very opposed to survivalists. He would see that as a kind of as a very backward and anti-enlightenment point of view. And he would probably, and he was one of the things that he was very interested in doing, especially near the end of his life, was talking about sort of what kind of an ethics of complementarity we could develop. And he really found that he felt that that was very much grounded in rationality and reason, and using our sort of reason to think about the whole of human history and the trajectory of what it means to be a human being, and how being in a social situation and being how just even for the example, the fact that it takes 18 years from infancy to really become fully socialized people, and how the community and the city really helps represent the fullest realization of our human potential.
If I could just add one thing really quick. I mean, I think that's a common kind of realist critique of like, hey, the train is already off the cliff. We can't wait around for direct democracy. But the irony is that the liberal state isn't doing it anyway, despite millions of people around the globe wanting this, millions of people marching in New York City saying, hey, we got to change something. So as with anything else, power seeks nothing without a demand, either taking it or forcing it to happen. And second, I mean, I would question, what's so great about living in an authoritarian world anyway. I mean, I don't know, I don't think bare life is the most exciting option out there. So if I'm going to have to live in an ecological dictatorship, well, that's not really my project. That's not top of my list.
May I speak?
Maybe one more person and then you.
Well, in light of the way people have reacted to the interview with that movie, and also the Charlie Hebdo incident, I feel like there's a lot of mass confusion about how to support free speech and how to conceptualize it. And I was wondering, and it's so key to democracy, I was wondering if he developed any theories about media.
Nothing pops to mind on that, actually, interestingly enough. But, so nothing pops to mind in Murray's work on free speech specifically, but I'm sure
That's an interesting question. I mean, obviously,
I'm sorry.
do you want to do it? Do you want to? I mean, the question has to do with free speech, and given the horrible massacre that occurred in France and Paris, and given the whole issue of what's going on with that film, The Interview, which is another story. What would Murray have sort of said about free speech? And obviously, I don't know that he directly addressed that in any particular written work, but certainly free speech is a fundamental freedom that must be protected, and one of the reasons why he supported majority voting as opposed to consensus in local organizations is because he felt that it was very important to protect the rights of the minority in terms of speech and political points of view, and that he felt that often those rights during the process of consensus were actually abrogated, in the sense that, often the person, as we know from the long experience with Occupy, the people who can be the most eloquent, the most persuasive kind of force or sort of propelled people who may have a differing point of view to agree because they don't want to be the one person doing the blocking. And so he felt that voting and actually having a majority vote preserved the rights of the minority to continue to elaborate their point of view, to try and convince other people. And certainly, obviously, he was an advocate of free speech and democratic conversation that would allow for that, the maximization of everybody's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question really had to do with the media.
With the media?
Yeah, just because in this day and age, it's like, how do we even think about how to achieve true freedom of speech when it's just so mediated and, I don't know, it's just...
You know, the question, one other thing is, of course, Murray died in 2006, and so he really died before social media took off the way it did. I mean, he was just not even really doing email very much. So, you know, it's a different world, and right now media is corporate controlled, and obviously, you know, one of the things that, on the one hand, social media is tremendously useful because it can do amazing things. On the other hand, I think he really felt there was no substitute for face-to-face democracy, for face-to-face meetings, because it really allows us to interact in a way that you can't just by pressing a button and taking a position on a referendum, because debate is important. And he felt that education was important, and he really advocated study groups and that kind of conversation that happens on a one-to-one basis. So it is very difficult with corporate controlled media. But I think that that's one reason why these kinds of local assemblies can be very powerful. And we see, and it's just one thing that I want to add, you know, one of the things that was exciting about what's going on in Rojava is that the work that has led to them being able in their communities, in some of these communities, to really institute this kind of libertarian municipalism, or what they call democratic confederalism, it didn't just happen out of nowhere. You know, it's been 10 years that people have been studying and thinking about these things and writing constitutions, and when the moment presented itself, they were really ready to step into the breach. And I think that one of the things that, you know, Murray emphasized is that you can't always, the time isn't right immediately necessarily to make this kind of social change. But if we start now, if we start working on the community level, when those opportunities present themselves, maybe instead of kind of what happened with Occupy, where it eventually just sort of dissipated, there was no way to institutionalize that impulse, then maybe, you know, we can be ready and really actually take it a step forward.
Would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, I have a comment to make. Based
Do you want to speak into the
Here,
mic
so people can
people
hear you back.
Okay. Hello. Okay. Theoretically, climate change. Let me see if I can remember this correctly. Well, climate change is more dependent on gravitational organization. Basically, as the gravitational wind fluctuates, the pattern of, how would you say, nature itself is evolved. And I find that political territorial boundaries should actually incorporate, how would you say, new weather adaptation, where we're able to actually build as like community and actually better strive on the nature that we now have ever grown. If that makes any sense to you. I'm trying to make it as general as possible, but it's too much to explain.
Like you said, it was a comment.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, easy question. So you guys used the word exciting multiple times to describe the situation in Rojava and the Kurdish regions generally, but I was wondering if you guys are just kind of concerned with sort of a potential over-association with Bookchin's aim with sort of what is ultimately a kind of a messy on-the-ground implementation in those regions, and worried about, you know, sort of as the curators of his legacy, sort of discursively, like if things were to go south in those areas, in effect similar to like how the degeneration of the worker state in the USSR amounted in the kind of popular imagination to a reputation of like Marxism proper, which of course doesn't really make any sense. but that doesn't mean that we're not still like trying to undo the effect of that, you know, kind of that direct association in the minds of people who maybe like aren't sitting, you know, not people going to activist workshops, things like that. And if you're sort of watching that with sort of excitement at the potential of the situation, but also well, both potential, but also sort of the negative potential of, you know, the degeneration of a single situation, like being overly powerful with respect to the legacy of Bookchin's work, which of course is, you know, much broader than any like single historical situation, like what's going on in right now.
Sure. I mean, anything can go south. But from reports on the ground now, and you know, we both know people who have been there. A friend of mine's there now. I'm hearing really inspiring stories of, you know, popular councils where Abyssinians and or Syrians and Yazidis are there, you know, having equal rights, even though they're, you know, persecuted ethnic minorities. 50%, you know, female participation mandated, which is pretty amazing anywhere, but let alone in the Middle East and let alone under attack by, you know, IS. So, I mean, of course, anything can go wrong, and we're not just, you know, uncritical cheerleaders, and I think you're right. I mean, Bookchin has a legacy beyond that. But on the other hand, it is very exciting to see that, because especially, I mean, you know, Ursula Le Guin wrote the preface for this book, and Bookchin was always heralded as kind of like a utopian social theorist, and yet here these ideas are being put into implementation in very extreme circumstances.
How does Bookchin think that revolution would come about? And I ask that for two reasons, two roadblocks, I guess. One is that the state has power, an army that would not want to cede power to municipalities. And secondly, maybe even more importantly, because the second roadblock would be that people themselves identify with nations. People themselves call themselves Americans. And I think that there would need to be some kind of re-education process, right, to secede, to help people sort of believe in the municipalities over the state, but also, my first point, how would the state sort of secede that power in the first place?
You want to start?
Sure. First of all, that's a great question, and in a certain sense, a very fundamental question, just because of the power of the nation state. And I think that one of the things that you know, Murray hoped is that as local communities really began to assert themselves, and this is a kind of also a very kind of multifaceted problem, but also a multifaceted effort in the sense that, you know, you have neighborhood planning assemblies, for example, but often neighborhood planning assemblies are relatively powerless. You know, they say, oh, we would like to suggest bike lanes here, but it's the city council that makes that decision. So it's a kind of a multifaceted process in the sense that you start with these assemblies, they take positions, and then how do you get even a local city council to acknowledge those positions? Well, eventually you run a candidate for city council, and hopefully if you have a couple of people who are elected to a city council, they use that power to in turn strengthen the neighborhood assemblies, to give them ever more power, and to make it so that you know, for example, and by the way, the municipalization of the economy is also an important aspect of this. So that if, for example, you have farmers markets and increasingly independent forms of economic organization, you no longer, you know, that mitigates against, for example, giant, you know, subsidies to agribusiness. But it's certainly a long process, and it's a kind of an interweaving process, a process of back and forth between the assemblies, and then eventually, hopefully, as, for example, in Vermont, you know, where you have these town meetings, if people can start to confederate with each other and thereby also create increased pressure against, say, a state assembly, that you're building, as Blair said, a sort of a dual power that will really contest the power first of the state and eventually of the nation state. And you know, I mean, part of the question also is sort of what is the alternative? And you know, I lived for many, many years in Vermont, and I'm sure a lot of you know that Bernie Sanders, who's the senator from Vermont now, and used to be the U.S. House member from Vermont, is talking about running for president. Well, I lived in Burlington when he was the mayor, and I actually worked for him when he was the U.S. representative, the representative to the United States House of Representatives. And what I learned from that experience, and I think we've all learned from any of us who voted for Barack Obama, is that representational politics is a dead end. And that, you know, if you're talking about how to change the nation state by electing people who you hope will carry the banner and hope will listen to the people who elected them, that you are really most often disappointed. And, you know, I'm just giving one example. You know, Sanders, and a lot of people put a lot of effort into Bernie Sanders, just as an example. And Sanders is now talking about running for president, and he's got a whole line about, you know, economy and workers and, you know, but in Burlington, he voted in favor of implementing a plan in which a whole bunch of F-35 fighter jets are going to be stationed at the airport in Burlington. This is going to be something that's going to be incredibly destructive to the community, not necessarily Burlington proper, but the surrounding communities, the town of Winooski. People are very upset about it, but there's not much that they can do about it. And so, even though this process is a long process and a difficult process, it seems to be one which I think, you know, which I would hope could actually have an impact. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, it's a strategic question and more of a theoretical question. I think education is key to this, but I mean, the essay Nationalism and the National Question very much talks about the emergence of nation states and nationalism as a source, as a process in history, and has a lot to say on the matter. I think also that the essay before is called Cities, the Unfolding of Reason in History, and it's not just a strategic question for Murray, why cities, why libertarian municipalism focus on the city level, because this is where historically diverse groups of people from different places, different ethnic groups came together in common and had to make decisions and broke down some of these parochial, tribal blood ties, and I think that's why, for him, this is really an important space.
I want to speak about what should be. I think practically it means, for instance, what should equality education? What should be independent media? What should be a sustainable agriculture? What should be a renewable energy? Or what should be an oppositional culture? Or a democratic economy? And so on. So I think we can go to a page. How we can be realized, how this can be realized, explained in the page 183. It speaks about confederation. All policy decisions, especially basic ones, are made at the base of the organization by its branches. Excuse me for my accent. It's not particularly good, but you have to see the sound. Decision made at the base, move to the top, and then back again in modified form to the base. And he speaks about committee. So, I mean, inside each branch, like quality education, sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, oppositional culture, independent media, democratic economy. Each one is divided in different committees, and they rise in confederation, like there are different delegates each committee has delegates, they rise in a confederation, and
if you could just summarize the question, like really concisely. There's a lot in there. I'm not sure what the main question is. Could you summarize the main question? What's the main question? There's a lot of information.
It's not a question.
Okay.
It's an answer to what he said, what should be, how practically realize what should be. You take different facts. The social move is divided in different branches. You have the education, you have agriculture, you have the energy, you have the job, you have the public service, you have the economy.
I think we get it.
For each one, you need to have the
different committees. You're saying.
You need to have the alternative spirit. So
sure.
Alternative spirit. What is it? The alternative spirit is education. Is quality education.
Okay, let's.
Sustainable agriculture. Is renewable energy.
All right, we're going to take another question. Thank you. Got it. And yes, the anarchist spirit and let 1,000 flowers bloom. Spencer.
Can I make a quick announcement?
Yeah, please.
If anyone wants to run out at 9 o'clock at the base in Bushwick, they're showing the film Anarchism in Rojava. It's on the M train to Central.
The base.
My question, there's kind of two very Bookchins. There's the early Bookchins raising to like abolishing hierarchy and ecology, and there's the later Bookchin where he gets really into democracy and in this sort of almost classic liberal sense. To me, the question is always like, so if you have a direct assembly of your community, why do you think it's going to be either anti-hierarchical? Why do you think people are either going to have this nuanced anti-hierarchical, with intersectionalist style politics, or ecological at all? I mean, to me, the two are like, you may or you may not. There's probably more conspiracy theorists in the U.S. than there are radical leftists. If you're funneling the communities with, maybe I'm too much of a Rothschild to get his point, but if you're funneling what a community is thinking, why do you think it's going to end up with the kind of vision you have?
In other words, you're saying that it can also go in a reactionary direction, right?
Well, yes.
Among other things. Among other things.
Among other things, but why do you think it's going to go in the direction that he outlines?
Well, first of all, obviously there are no guarantees, but I think that for Murray, one of the things that he did, his whole lifelong, part of his lifelong project was that he engaged in study groups, and he really did. I lived with him in the course of growing up, and even as an adult at times. For decade after decade, he taught, and he had people who came over to the house, and they studied history, and I think that he is hopeful that people who are engaged by the idea of libertarian municipalism will be not only educating themselves, but sort of working within assemblies to educate other people, and that people will hopefully, through debate and through discussion, come to see that the kinds of values that we hold are really the values that will not only save the planet, but will also increase emancipation and freedom. And no, it's true. I mean, there's no guarantees. You can have very parochial points of view, but one hopes that through the process of debate and discussion, that the values of ecology, that the values of emancipation, and that basic Enlightenment values will win the day.
Yeah, just briefly, I think you point to an interesting tension in his work, and I would say that Murray in his later works draws on a civic republican tradition rather than a classical liberal tradition, as you said. I mean, classical liberalism wants to subdivide power. It sees that there's different social interests in society, and especially in class society, so all you can do is check and balance, divide it up, and you have pluralistic interest groups, whereas I think the civic republican tradition, going from Aristotle to Hannah Arendt, sees that in the process of democratic deliberation, there is an actual transformation of those interests. They're not just given. And that this goes hand in glove with Murray's insistence that every revolutionary project is also an educational project, and that politics becomes actually a source of pedia, of education, self-education, transformation of interests, and into a common interest. He was very concerned, in contrast to Marxism's focus on class interest, on discerning a general interest. And yeah, there's no silver bullet, but I think that's, he said, let's go to the political arena and let's try it there.
Other hands? There was a few more? Or not?
Kevin.
I have one. So, is the book available?
It is. Good question. There's a stack here in the middle of this table. And oh, up front, now I see that they propped one up. I'm not sure what they're going for. You can ask up there.
I have a real question about the So, Debbie, you mentioned twice actually this evening the relationship between Murray and Vermont. And I'm wondering, and I've wondered for quite some time, looking at his work, if he's not just simply influenced by the systems of self-government that exist in Vermont and still exist in a lot of different frameworks, but it's directly derivative in a big way. And I'm wondering if you feel, especially growing up with him and seeing his influences and that period of change that Spencer just noted that he went through, if in fact Vermont itself was a big influence on his work. So for instance, he ended up in Tucson, Arizona, or in the Pacific Northwest, where you come to the same political conclusions. Was it the environment that he was so engaged with that kind of resulted in the Libertarian municipalism project?
That's a fun sort of biographical question. He moved to Vermont in 1971, and it was really part of the, and of course, as you probably know, he grew up in New York and had lived in New York and was very active right here in this neighborhood in the Lower East Side for many years, working first with CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality, and then very involved in the whole beat movement and then the anti-war movement. But he was part of that out-migration of the city that occurred in the early 70s. And he chose Burlington partly because it was a small town, or at that time seemed like a small town compared to New York, and wanted to, and did in fact, working with other people, create an environment and a milieu where people could really get together and work on the local level. And they started a coffee house, and they had study groups, and they were and eventually developed a whole green political party. Party in the loosest sense of the term. I mean, there was a sort of the Burlington Greens, and they did all kinds of. They undertook all kinds of initiatives, and they actually had a pretty big impact for a period of time in the 80s on Vermont politics, in the sense that they managed to stop, almost single-handedly stop a huge development on the Burlington waterfront that our progressive mayor and city council wanted to put into place. I think that it was, that he was certainly aware of the town meeting tradition, but he was also a student of the whole sort of long history of sort of, within from the American Revolution onward. And so I'm not so sure whether Vermont town meetings actually influenced libertarian municipalism, because he was really, in the Forms of Freedom, one of his very early articles from 1968, he was already writing about these ideas. But I think it reinforced, that he was appreciative of it and enthralled in a certain sense by it. I mean, he loved town meeting. He used to sometimes, Burlington was a city that was so big that most of the things that went on there were by ballot, but he would go to smaller towns and attend town meetings there and really saw it as part of a tradition that could speak to Americans, and that was another aspect of it, that he wanted to draw on uniquely American traditions, so that, instead of looking sort of always to the socialism of Europe. Do you want to add anything?
More or less what you just said, and in part I think it was also a response to the turn to Maoism and Marxism in the late New Left that was so alienating to a lot of folks in the United States, that you want to draw on some different indigenous traditions, but those were also very much leavened by, going all the way back, what? going all the way back to ancient Athens, but also throughout, revolutionary European history, etc.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? If not, then thanks a lot for coming out, and if you're interested, please pick up a book and support Bluestockings. It's a great institution with direct ties to social ecology, since Brooke Lehman taught up there for a long time.
I have a question. Your book, does it detail everything you spoke on today?
Yeah, it touches on a lot.
And what is it called again?
It's this book here. The Next Revolution, Popular Assemblies and the Promise of Direct Democracy. There's a nice little personal foreword by Ursula Glenn.
And a wonderful introduction.
Oh, and an introduction by
Are you
us.
looking to reshape democracy?
I think we're all looking to reshape democracy.
I'm looking to do away with all.
Thanks a lot.